Hi guys, welcome back to Day Drinking with Bilbo. It's Monday, April something, and today's class will be slightly different from the previous classes because there's no food involved today. I'm actually just teaching you all about whiskeys and how to properly drink those whiskeys. Now I know you're sad that Alyssa's not sitting next to me, but it is a work day for her. So we do have an episode, like a bonus episode that we filmed over the weekend. I'll release that at some point this week for you. Since I know many of you tune in only to hear her opinion and not mine. Anyway, we are still having 3 different alcohols today. They'll all be whiskey based. However, because I'll be comparing each one to itself, if you only have one type of whiskey in your house, you can still participate. Go grab that one type of whiskey. Now, what you want to do is you want a rocks glass, which is like this size here, and you're going to want to pour yourself 2 ounces. So this is called a jigger. This top section here is 1 ounce. This bottom section here is a ½ ounce. Now, if you're making yourself a mixed drink, you get one of each size of alcohol in that mixed drink. If you're doing, let's say, a rum and coke or a whiskey sour, typically you're going to pour 1.5 ounces of whatever alcohol you're using in there. If you're pouring it just by itself into a glass, it's 2 of the big boys, 2 ounces. That's a good pour. And then, thusly, when you're at a bar or something, you're ordering a double, that should be 4 ounces. Yeah. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to use a blended whiskey, an American whiskey, a bourbon, and a scotch, which are my 3 standards that I happen to have a lot of in the house because I enjoy drinking them. We're going to try each whiskey just by itself, straight out of the glass. We call that neat. That means that there's no ice, no mix-ins, nothing. It's just the whiskey. You poured it from the bottle into your jigger and then into the glass. That's called neat. Then we're going to take that same whiskey that we try, and we're going to add a splash of water. And I'll show you what that means when we get to the first one. And then we're going to take that same whiskey, and we're going to put it on ice, or on the rocks, as they say. On the rocks means over ice. It's still no add-ins. We're literally just working with whiskeys and water today, basically, either in ice form or liquid form. Now, what you need is your glass of whiskey, your jigger to measure your pour. I'm doing, remember, 3 different whiskeys here, so I have 3 glasses. You're going to want a glass of water that you can actually get your hand into, so don't make it that's why I'm not using my hydro flask today. And then just have some ice on standby as well, because you're going to need that as well. So we're going to start with our blended whiskey. An American whiskey, a blended whiskey, basically means that there's no regulation regarding what it has to be based on. So, as you well know, when we get to bourbon, that has to be made from 51% corn. Rye has to be made from 51% rye. A blended whiskey doesn't have that restriction, okay? An American whiskey obviously has to be made in America, has to be distilled to 80%, but that's it. There's no other real rules around that. So, blended whiskey is tasty and smooth, light and refreshing. I do like that sip. That first sip's always a fun one, especially in the middle of the day. Now, we're going to try that same whiskey, our American whiskey. We're going to put a splash of water in it. Now, I don't mean that you're going to take your water glass and pour it in. I literally do mean a splash. What you're going to do is take your glass of water, take your finger, dip it in the water so it's nice and wet, and you get some drippage off that, see? Then, you're going to take your whiskey glass, and you're going to take that watered finger and just drip some of that water into that glass. Give it a little swirl there, yeah? Then you're going to take another sip. We're going to see how that changes the whiskey flavor. So, I know what that does because I teach whiskey classes all the time. But for those of you that haven't attended one or are unaware of what's going on in your palate right now, if you notice, that whiskey got a lot mellower and a lot more open. And when I say open, I'm talking about on your palate, right? So there's actually chemical reaction that's happening in the glass when you add something like water to whiskey. And it doesn't take a lot. That's why I said literally it's just a finger. So when you say with a splash, you're talking about just a little splash of water. Now, when you go to a commercial bar, I'm looking at Applebee's, Chili's, places like that, and you ask for a splash of water, they're going to use that little gun and shoot a substantial amount of water in. That's not how I like to drink it. I like it as a true splash. So you're going to take just your little fingertip, little splash of water in there. Third way we're going to drink it is to take our ice And I like to say 3 cubes. If you're doing a single pour like this, remember, which is 2 ounces, I'm going to add 3 cubes into it. Now, I'm going to let this sit for a second while I talk to you because you do want the ice to have a chance to do something. What the ice is going to do is, first, it's going to chill the drink. Some people prefer it chilled. It depends what whiskey I'm drinking. I often just like it straight out of the bottle that's been sitting on the counter or on your bar top or wherever. But sometimes I like it out of the fridge where it's nice and chilly. It depends on what kind of mood I'm in, what I'm pairing it with, and which type of whiskey I'm drinking. Remember, we're still on our American whiskey here, our blended whiskey. We tried it neat, which is straight from the bottle. We tried it with the splash, which was a tiny little drop of water. And now we're trying it on the rocks, which means adding ice. Now, what this is going to do for you, go ahead and take your sip. In addition to chilling it, you're going to notice that what happened with the splash is amplified now with the ice, but it's also slowed down. So ice takes time to melt, right? At the end of this, once your ice all melted, you essentially have whiskey and water, right? And that's what the splash does, that chemical reaction. If you add more than just a splash, all it's doing is watering that whiskey down. It's going to make your drink last a little longer because there's more liquid volume in there, right? But because ice takes time to melt and it's not instantaneous, it's this elongated process, and it actually makes it so it's a much smoother drink, which is why you hear people order stuff on the rocks. Now, on this American whiskey, I like whiskey neat. Okay, that's usually my go-to is whiskey is neat, especially a blended whiskey like this because it's already smooth and mellow. Irish whiskey, same thing. I would drink that neat all day long. I do the splash for really your benefit. I don't ever really put a splash in my whiskey. The exception will be the Scotch, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The ice, I do actually do that often as well, but it's weather dependent. So right now it's cold out here. It's raining. That's why I'm filming inside. I would not have a whiskey on the rocks. I also would do it during the day as opposed to at nighttime. Ice during the day, room temp at night. And that's just a personal preference. But here's the thing about it. You drink it any way you want, anytime you want, any way that you want. You know what I mean? If you like it on the rocks, if you prefer that elongated chemical reaction that's happening with the ice melting, then drink it that way. As long as you're enjoying your whiskey, that's all that really matters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a drink here to cleanse, and then we're going to move on to bourbon next. Now, bourbon, as I said before, has to be made from 51% corn. It also has to be distilled to 80%. The interesting thing about it, though, is it had to be made in Kentucky. And that's why Jack Daniels is Tennessee whiskey. Jack Daniels is bourbon. But they couldn't call it bourbon because it wasn't made in Kentucky when Jack Daniels first came out. So it was called Tennessee whiskey instead. Now, that rule has been relaxed and it's changed because a lot of distilleries everywhere said, hey, we want to make bourbon, but we're not in Kentucky. And so the United States of American government and the people that make these decisions went, great, we'll allow it. So now bourbon has to be made in the United States, not necessarily in Kentucky. Still 51% corn, at least. It can be more, but it has to be at least 51% corn. And has to be distilled to 80%. Now, I've always touted that bourbon is sweeter. And that's why. It's because it's 51% corn. And corn, believe it or not, is actually very sweet. You might not notice it if you're eating it like a corn on the cob, if you're eating it with like a red meat and potato kind of dish. You might not notice that forward sweetness because it's being kind of masked by the butter you put on it and the salt you put on it and then the red meat and the potatoes that you're having. But corn is, in and of itself, a very sweet vegetable. So it makes bourbon a very sweet drink. Now we're going to start with that first sip, remember. Bourbon always will be my absolute favorite whiskey. I don't see that ever changing. Our next sip's with the splash. And you notice that I'm not changing I'm not cleansing in between the comparisons of the bourbon because that's just going to put water on my palate anyway, and that's literally what I'm doing by adding a splash. So it doesn't matter. I give it a little shake. I just did the finger drop, right? Maybe 3 drops went in there. It really doesn't take much to get that chemical reaction to happen. So, personally, I would never drink bourbon this way. Bourbon is great all on its own. I would never add a splash if I wasn't doing this class for you. I'm going to add my ice cubes now. We're going to let that sit for a second. And the reason being, because bourbon is sweet, you don't have to mellow that out. With a harsher whiskey, like you'll see when we get to the Scotch, a lot of people want to mellow that out. I don't want to do that with bourbon. I want it straight from the bottle. And I just want to sit and enjoy it. It's very warming and soothing, especially on a cold day like today. So we let the ice sit for just a second there. Not only is that a lot colder, but I'm kind of losing the bourbon essence. And I mean, the ice is not melted yet. It hasn't watered down the beverage terribly. But it just kind of made it fall flat on my palate, and that's not what I want. If I'm going to have a flat beverage, I might as well drink the water. You know what I mean? Obviously, bourbon, I'm a neat person. I want it neat. Just pour it straight in the glass, and you don't even have to measure. Just go like this with the bottle, count to 3 or 4, and then stop. So I definitely wouldn't do that. But again, if you enjoy drinking on the rocks or with a splash, then do it. I'd rather you drink bourbon that way than didn't drink bourbon at all. Moving on to our third beverage, we're going with Scotch. You'll notice it's a lot darker than the other two. Scotch has to be made in Scotland. That's right. It's whiskey from Scotland. Now, interesting story, whiskey spelt with an E everywhere else except Canada and Scotland. And that's a Scottish thing. I mean, Scotland started it. They just didn't have the E in there. And Canada kind of took that route. As far as spelling. Doesn't matter how you spell it, you're right either way. But if you're going to be traditional with it, Scotch whiskey is spelt without the E. Now, Scotch, remember, is very smoky. Oh, I can smell the smoke coming off that glass, and I like a good smoky Scotch, so that's really nice for me. You're going to take that first sip, and you get that smoke coating on your mouth, right? Now, this is the most interesting one that you're going to find, and I hope that you were able to find some Scotch in your cupboard and you're able to participate in this one. When I do the splash with the Scotch, it's going to completely change this. Ready? 90% of that smokiness just goes away. And you saw, I mean, it's literally a drop of water off of my finger. It's very interesting. Now, Scotch is the drink that craves that water. It craves ice or a splash. And the reason being is Scotch needs to be able to open up on your palate, and water does that chemical reaction that we talked about. If you're drinking Scotch neat, and I do on occasion, but usually I prefer it on the rocks, you're going to get cigar smoke all constantly on your palate. Just repeat cigar smoke. And that's cool if you're drinking it with, say, a red steak or something. That smokiness lends well. If you watched the episode we did yesterday, it actually paired really strangely well with the cheese pizza because it gave us that wood-fired pizza effect on our palate. That's what Scotch is going to do. That smokiness is going to take over everything, right? If it's a cold night and you're just having a glass by itself or smoking a cigar with it, sure, drink it neat all day long. I prefer it on the rocks or like with that splash there. And it did so much. It just, that little drop of water just does so much on the palate. It's so interesting. Now, I added my ice, my rocks. I don't actually have to let those sit very long in Scotch. It's almost instantaneous, right? All it's going to do past that first initial point is water the beverage down. So now it's this foresty beverage. It's not so much smoke. It just tastes like nature now. Simple. I added 3 ice cubes, right? I like Scotch. That's the only one that you'll hear me say I prefer it on the rocks as opposed to neat. So, you got to have whiskey 3 ways today, and if you participated in full, then you had 3 different whiskeys in 3 ways, or 9 tastings. I hope you enjoy this little break from the food pairings. It's hard to arrange filming schedules with meals and figuring out what I can eat and if I do it after lunch, did I blow my palate out with what I had for lunch? So today we decided to just do this real simple whiskey tasting for you. I hope you learned a little bit about whiskey today. If you have questions, I'm a self-proclaimed whiskey expert. Ask them in the comments below. And if you don't own one of these jiggers, go out and get yourself one. Do yourself a favor because it makes measuring so much easier because you know you've got that ounce and that half ounce. And some even mixed drink recipes will have you use these in various ways, especially with your mixers, right? We talked about martinis the other day. Thanks so much for being here. As always, we're in this together, this quarantine thing that's happening, so make sure you wash those hands, stay 6 feet away from other people, and if you can, just stay home. Don't go out, guys. The quicker we can get on board with this, the quicker it's all going to be over for us, right? So thanks for joining. We'll see you tomorrow for the next episode of Day Drinking with Bilbo.